Why did Lewis Hamilton's podium charge at Zandvoort collapse the moment Charles Leclerc ignored two direct Ferrari radio orders to move over during the 2026 Dutch Grand Prix? That is the specific, unresolved tension that defined a race where strategy errors cost the team a guaranteed top 3 finish, and it is the exact moment that turned a routine team order into a public controversy involving the 7-time world champion. You might expect this story to end with a formal FIA investigation or some dramatic new evidence emerging from the steward's room to validate the outrage, but the reality of what actually happened in those critical seconds around lap 35 raises a far more uncomfortable question about internal trust at Maranello that we still have not fully answered. The immediate fallout was explosive, yet the true consequence of that delay remains the open loop hanging over Ferrari's 2026 campaign, because while we know Hamilton finished 4th and missed the podium, we do not yet know if this operational failure has permanently fractured the relationship between their star driver and the pit wall. Lewis Hamilton was absolutely fuming on the team radio after being stuck behind his own teammate, and the verified audio captures a frustration that went far beyond standard racing complaints. He asked his engineers directly if they were using him as a guinea pig, before demanding to know what was going on and how long he would be forced to stay out in dirty air while his championship hopes evaporated. This was not a polite request for clarification. It was a raw expression of disbelief that Ferrari had left him trapped behind a car on 4-lap older tires when the pace delta was obvious to everyone watching the timing screens. But here is where the narrative gets complicated, because despite the intensity of that broadcast moment, there is no official regulatory finding to point to. No FIA inquiry was ever launched. No technical fault was logged. The scandal exists entirely within the gray area of team management and human decision-making under pressure, which makes it infinitely harder to resolve than a simple penalty or disqualification. So, what exactly broke down in that exchange? Race fans reported specifically that Leclerc failed to obey 2 distinct orders to pit while he held Hamilton up, framing it as a clear case of non-compliance rather than a strategic disagreement. Yet even as that report circulated, other details remained stubbornly unverified, creating a gap between what the headlines promised and what the data actually confirmed. We know Hamilton eventually got past. We know it was a lap later than he says he should have. We know that lost time is what he blamed post-race for failing to catch George Russell for 3rd place. But the precise reason why those 2 radio calls went unanswered in real time has never been officially explained by the driver himself, leaving us to piece together the motive from fragmented reports and secondhand interpretations. The stakes were enormous. Lando Norris took his 2nd consecutive win of the 2026 season, Kimi Antonelli finished 2nd, George Russell completed the podium. Ferrari, meanwhile, walked away with 4th and 5th, a result that felt like a defeat precisely because it was self-inflicted. When a team loses positions to pure pace, that is one thing. When they lose them because the driver does not respond to instructions and the strategy falls apart as a result, that strikes at the core of operational credibility. And that is exactly why Hamilton's anger resonated so loudly, because it was not just about one race weekend. It was about whether Ferrari can execute the flawless teamwork required to support a title challenge when the pressure is highest. Tension ran high. Trust eroded instantly. Questions multiplied rapidly. The paddock reaction was swift, with GP Blog and Motorsport.com both centering Hamilton's radio outburst as the defining moment of Ferrari's entire Dutch Grand Prix. Sunday Guardian Live ran a headline reflecting Hamilton's own stated desire for an internal conversation rather than a public ultimatum. But even that framing only tells part of the story, because while the media focused on the confrontation, the underlying operational breakdown that caused it remains the real issue that Ferrari must now address before the next race. Let's zoom in on the exact mechanics of that lap 35 failure, because the 4-lap tire offset between the 2 Ferraris was not just a minor variable, but the single most critical data point that made Leclerc's non-compliance so damaging to Hamilton's race. When your teammate is circulating on rubber that has completed 4 more laps than yours, the performance delta is typically in the range of 6 to 8 tenths per lap at Zandvoort. Meaning every second spent stuck behind him translates directly into track position. You cannot recover through driving alone. Ferrari knew this number before the race started. They had modeled it in their pre-race simulations. And yet when the moment arrived to execute the planned swap, the instruction went out over the radio and simply did not result in the expected action. 2 separate calls. 0 compliance. The strategy window slammed shut while Hamilton sat powerless in turbulent air watching his podium chance bleed away tenth by tenth. Why would a driver ignore a direct team order in the middle of a Grand Prix? That is the question that has dominated every post-race analysis. But the answer may be less about defiance and more about the chaotic reality of processing information at 200 miles per hour while managing tire temperature, fuel loads, and defensive positioning against cars behind. Leclerc was not running in clean air either. He was fighting his own degradation battle on older compounds, and from inside the cockpit, the request to yield position might have felt like sacrificing his own race for a strategic benefit he could not personally verify in real time. This does not excuse the outcome. It does, however, complicate the simple narrative of insubordination that some outlets rush to publish. The gap between what the pit wall sees on their monitors and what a driver experiences through the steering wheel is where these operational failures are born, and that gap was catastrophically wide at Zandvoort. Orders went unanswered, tires degraded further, time vanished completely. By the time Hamilton was finally released past his teammate, the damage had already compounded beyond recovery. He was no longer just one lap behind where he needed to be. He was now dealing with overheated brakes from following closely, compromised tire surface from running in dirty air, and a psychological frustration that no amount of engineering reassurance could immediately reset. The 4-lap offset that should have been Ferrari's tactical advantage had instead become the anchor dragging both drivers down the order. Lando Norris was already pulling away at the front, Antonelli was consolidating second, Russell was extending his gap to third, and Hamilton was left to process the realization that his best opportunity to stand on the podium in 2026 had been lost not to a faster car or a better driver, but to a breakdown in basic team coordination. So where does that leave our understanding of what actually went wrong inside Ferrari's garage that afternoon? The confirmed facts are stark enough without embellishment. Lap 35, 2 ignored radio calls. A 4-lap tire disadvantage that turned into a race-defining liability. But the human element underneath those numbers remains the harder story to tell, because it involves split-second judgments made under extreme duress by people who normally operate with precision. Fred Vasseur later addressed the team's strategic intentions for the weekend in response to the criticism, acknowledging implicitly that something had gone off script even as he defended the original plan. His comments suggest Ferrari believes the strategy itself was sound and that execution, not conception, was the failure point. That distinction matters enormously for how the team moves forward, because fixing a communication breakdown is fundamentally different from rethinking an entire strategic philosophy. The cost of getting this wrong was measured in championship points, podium trophies, and the fragile confidence between a driver and his engineers. Hamilton's post-race assessment was blunt. He stated clearly that the delay behind Leclerc is what prevented him from having the pace to challenge Russell for third. That is not speculation. It is his direct reading of the race based on telemetry he reviewed after the checkered flag. When a driver of his experience identifies a specific moment as the inflection point where victory became impossible, it carries weight regardless of whether external observers agree with every detail of his interpretation. This is where it gets serious. The frustration boiling over on the Ferrari radio was not merely about losing a single podium at Zandvoort, but about whether a 7-time world champion can trust his team to execute basic operations during the critical phase of the 2026 championship fight. When Hamilton asked his engineers if they were using him as a guinea pig, he was articulating a fear that goes far deeper than one botched team order. He was questioning whether his car was being treated as a strategic testbed rather than a genuine title contender, and that distinction carries enormous weight when every point separates contenders in what has become the tightest season in recent memory. The phrase "great waste of time" was not hyperbole. It was a precise calculation of opportunity cost delivered in real time by a driver who understood exactly how much track position he was surrendering with each passing second. Frustration peaked audibly, trust fractured publicly, consequences lingered privately. Those verified quotes captured by Motorsport.com and GP Blog represent the most unfiltered window we have into Hamilton's mindset during that disastrous stint, and they reveal a level of operational distrust that no post-race press release can easily erase. When a driver invokes the guinea pig comparison, he is referencing a specific historical pattern in Formula One, where one car is sacrificed to gather data or protect another driver's strategy. And whether or not Ferrari intended that outcome is almost irrelevant compared to the fact that Hamilton perceived it happening to him in real time. His question, "What's going on?" was not a request for telemetry. It was a demand for transparency from a pit wall that had failed to communicate its intentions clearly enough to prevent confusion under race conditions. And his follow-up, asking how long he would be forced to stay out, was the sound of a driver recognizing that his engineers had lost control of the strategic timeline. The pace deficit to George Russell compounded with every lap spent in Leclerc's wake, transforming what should have been a manageable gap into an insurmountable barrier. Russell was running in clean air, managing his tires optimally, and building a cushion that Hamilton could never have matched even if he had been released immediately after the first radio call. By the time the swap finally occurred, the mathematical reality had already shifted beyond recovery. This is why Hamilton's anger carried such specific technical justification rather than generic emotion. He was not fuming because he disliked following his teammate. He was fuming because he could see the exact moment when third place became mathematically impossible, and he was powerless to prevent it despite having the faster car and the fresher tires. That helplessness is what transforms a strategic error into a crisis of confidence. Remember how this all started, with the question of why Hamilton's podium charge collapsed when Leclerc ignored 2 direct orders around lap 35? That opening tension now resolves into something more troubling than simple non-compliance, because the radio exchanges reveal that Hamilton did not just experience a delayed team order, but actively perceived himself as being deprioritized within Ferrari's operational hierarchy. The guinea pig comment connects directly back to that initial 4-lap tire offset, suggesting that from Hamilton's perspective inside the cockpit, the entire strategic framework felt designed to extract information rather than maximize his result. Whether that perception matches Ferrari's actual intent is secondary to the operational reality that their star driver felt expendable in a moment when he needed absolute commitment. So, what does this mean for Ferrari's internal dynamics moving forward? The Sunday Guardian live headline quoting Hamilton's desire to discuss the matter internally suggests he understands the difference between public accountability and private resolution, but the severity of his language on the radio indicates that any internal conversation will need to address fundamental questions about decision-making authority and communication protocols. Vasseurs' separate comments defending the team's strategic intentions acknowledge that criticism exists without conceding that the strategy itself was flawed, which creates a delicate balancing act between supporting his drivers and maintaining operational credibility. The stakes have escalated from one lost podium to the broader question of whether Ferrari can sustain a championship challenge when their primary driver feels uncertain about his team's commitment to his success.